machine. First level operators of the machine are the political figures, the public officials. But who are the ultimate operators? I mean, I like to think of somebody driving in a chauffeur-driven limousine. Well, who's the initial operator of the chauffeur-driven limousine? It's the chauffeur, right?
Right.
But who's really in control? It's the guy in the back seat. It's the owner. So now if he sees the chauffeur putting salad oil instead of gasoline into the gas tank, I guess it's his responsibility to roll down the window and say, Joe, you're doing the wrong thing here. You're going to ruin this Mercedes. And if Joe doesn't correct his behavior, then the owner, I take it, would fire him and get someone in that position of chauffeur who knew what he was doing and would follow the instructions in the owner's manual. Now, this is our difficulty. We've been watching, in my lifetime, it's several generations, all right, 2 or 3 generations, 50 years, been paying attention to this nonsense. We've been watching one chauffeur after another drive this Mercedes over and over again into a ditch. And we're sitting in the back seat there, essentially with our fingers in our ear, doing nothing. So who's responsible? Do we blame the Mercedes? Obviously not. It's the chauffeur. But insofar as we're in control of the chauffeur, have the ability to control the chauffeur, we're really responsible for this mess. We the people. And of course that comes back to the preamble of the Constitution, which tells us, we the people ordained and established the Constitution. Not politicians, not political parties, not special interest groups, not the people even who are elected to office, but we the people. So we have this oversight responsibility. After all, this is a self-governing republic, right? That's the terminology we like to use. Self-governing. Well, self-governing means that we're doing something ourselves. And unfortunately, we're not doing enough of that governing ourselves.
What is there to do? Explain it. Explain it, because I would bet you if you ask people, 90% of the people, no matter what party they're from, would say, we don't know what else to do. What is there to do? It's going on like a train running down the track at 1,000 miles an hour, unchecked, like a defilement of everything this country is about. What is there to do?
Well, I come back to one point in the Constitution. If you read the Second Amendment, most people are concerned about that final line, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. But it's the beginning of the Second Amendment that really has the punch to it. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. Stop right there. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. That's the only place in the Constitution where the Constitution says anything is necessary for any purpose whatsoever. It doesn't say Congress is necessary, the President is necessary, the Supreme Court is necessary. The only thing it says is necessary to the security of a free state is a well-regulated militia. And I take it that a free state is what the Constitution is about as an entirety. It's to give us this political mechanism which will guarantee a free state. So here the Constitution is telling us that to maintain the security of this system, the whole shebang, as it were, we need this entity, or entities actually, as it turns out, called a well-regulated militia. And in the body of the Constitution, this appears in the term the militia of the several states, because there's supposed to be one in every one of the states.
Describe what a militia is.
Well, that's the point. That's my next point. Well, what is this thing? Well, or what are these things?
I'll tell you what I've thought it was, and I'm not saying I know what it was or what it is. What I've always perceived a militia were angry, upset people that were getting their guns together and going to fight the system.
We don't get to that stage. If you look historically,
I mean, that's as a young person. That's what
that's what I was. People tend to think of 1775. They tend to think of Lexington and Concord. But if you look behind that, if you look behind the shot heard around the world, the colonial militias, which is the constitutional basis for all of this, were statutory organizations. There was always a statute someplace that organized the entire able-bodied free male population. Because, of course, they had slaves in those days, so they didn't include the slaves. They couldn't arm the slaves. And women were not considered appropriate to be involved in that kind of activity. So it was the free, essentially free white male population from 16 to 60 typically 16 to 50, 16 to 60, and they picked those ages because you were mature enough when you were 16, and by the time you got to be 50, 55, or 60, you had rheumatism, you couldn't see very well, you couldn't hear, whatever. You were physically incapable, usually, of performing the necessary functions. They didn't kick you out of the militia, but they didn't require you to be a member of the militia once you reached that upper age limit. But the basic idea was to organize everyone within the community to perform what we would now call Homeland Security functions. And in those days, I think they were simpler than what we have today. They didn't have quite as many problems as we did then. They were more quasi-military or quasi-police. Obviously, they had problems with the Indians. If you were in an area where the French or the Spanish were, you might have actually had military problems. They fought a number of wars during the 1700s. So there's a quasi-military function, and those people were trained according to the disciplinary structure of the regular armed forces. They were all required to be armed, typically with a firearm that they purchased themselves out of the free market, unless they were too poor, in which case the government supplied them with a gun. That was gun control in those days. Everyone had to have a gun. You either bought your own, or if you couldn't buy your own, the government would get you one. All right? Exactly the opposite of what we have today.
Is the militia just another word for the armed forces? Is the militia just another word for the armed forces?
No.
Okay, explain that.
In the colonial period, they had, each of the colonies would raise troops. And the troops were part of what they considered to be their regular armed forces. The militia was the organization of everybody. So you see in the U.S. Constitution, the militia of the several states are referred to, and then they also refer to the troops or ships of war that states may keep with the consent of Congress, which is a different thing. Because the states had these two bodies, the militia and the regular armed forces. Just as now, under the Constitution, we have two, so supposed to have two forces, one being the regular armed forces, the Army and the Navy of the United States, and the other being the militia of the several states, which are now 50, supposedly 50, separate entities, which Congress can call forth, that's the language in the Constitution, for three purposes: execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, repel invasions. And otherwise, those 50 entities are institutions for dealing with Homeland Security problems within each of the states. Now, these are not simply military or police entities. If that's all they were, that's all they were intended to be, it's very unlikely that the Founding Fathers would have bothered to be sure that they were permanent parts of the constitutional structure, or that the Founding Fathers would have told us that a well-regulated militia is necessary to the security of a free state. They understood that these entities were ultimately political bodies, because if you organize everyone in your community, as they did, in small units, typically 50 or 60 men in each one of these militia companies, and those people are coming together on a regular basis for training, and in any event, they're all living in the same neighborhoods, right? Because each one of these units was essentially a community unit. What are they going to be doing? Well, they're going to be talking about a lot more than the weather or the scores of a baseball game. They're going to be talking about political and economic matters in their own communities, local communities, in their states, in the nation. They're going to be actually a place for political ferment and discussion, which will then lead them to do other things, among which might be to become involved in political campaigns, to vote for political office, or if they see things going wrong, to take other kinds of action. And this is where we've broken down, because now the extent to which people are involved in political action in this country depends upon either the extent to which they're involved in political parties, and there aren't very many who are always involved in political parties, or when they become involved during an election campaign every 2 or 4 years, or if they're involved in some special interest group promoting some special interest legislation. But the vast mass of people don't do any of those things except every 2 and 4 years when the elections come up. Most of the rest of the time, they are really apolitical. And why are they apolitical? Because this huge organizational structure, which was there at the time the Constitution was ratified and was included in the Constitution for a good and sufficient reason, atrophied. And what eventually happened, early